Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you who have tuned in to this much anticipated fireside chat with Singapore Minister for Trade and Industry, Mr. Chan Chung-Sing. I'm Denise Rutherford, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs at 3M, and I am so excited to moderate this session on government and policy transformation. This session will cover several topics that many of us follow very closely, as they have an impact on growth and prosperity, as well as the business environment, ranging from topics such as economic recovery, business travel, policy transformation, supply chain shifts, and geopolitics. Before we invite Minister Chen to share his valuable perspectives, please allow me to briefly introduce him. Although he is well known as a public figure to most of us and really needs no further introduction. As Minister for Trade and Industry, Minister Chan is responsible for driving Singapore's economic and industrial development. Starting his political career a decade ago in 2011, Mr. Chen has led various key appointments and led strategic policy reforms to improve the lives of people in the community and to ensure that Singapore is future ready. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Chen and the Ministry of Trade and Industry, including its statutory boards such as the Economic Development Board, have also played an instrumental role in keeping borders open and minimizing disruptions to supply chains of critical products and personal protective equipment. Welcome, Minister Chen. We are honored to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation and your insights.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for having me over as well.
Great. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And so let's start with a few general questions to warm up our audience. How does Singapore intend to position itself in this complex, changing world?
Well, Denise, I think the way to perhaps start this conversation is to share the perspective that Singapore's take, which is that even prior to COVID, we understand and appreciate that there are certain forces that are going to reshape the way the global economy is going to work. And we have been preparing ourselves to respond to those forces and to seize the opportunities that comes with it. Now, let me start with some of these more global forces that have been around even before COVID. The first, I think, has to be the rise of geopolitical issues, and that has caused greater uncertainty in the global economic environment. And I think there's also a greater chance whereby economic decisions are shaped and influenced by geopolitical issues. So that's the issue of a greater uncertainties. The second issue that has been driving the global economy has certainly to be technological disruptions. And the pace of technological disruption, particularly on the digital and data side, has been accelerating. And we need to prepare for economy that embrace this disruption, or we will end up being the one that's to be disrupted. Now, the third set of forces that we have to contend with is that with the technological disruptions and the geopolitical uncertainties, the gap between the haves and the have-not within a society and between societies have widened and is likely to continue to widen in the coming years. So these are three set of forces that I think we have to deal with or without COVID. But certainly COVID has, I would say, compounded the challenges. Now, let's look at the three set of forces again. I think the geopolitical uncertainties have been compounded by COVID because with the disruption in the supply chains, the tendency for protectionist measures have increased across the world. So the normal, smooth functioning of the global production and supply chains have been disrupted, not just by the pandemic, but also by man-made policies, restrictions by man-made policies that includes tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. The second has to do with the technological disruption. Now, there are both pluses and minuses from COVID. The digital adoption and disruption has accelerated. And many of the digital giants will say that they have been able to achieve in perhaps 10 months what would have taken them years to achieve previously in terms of digital adoption and disruption. So that is going to accentuate the gap between those who are able to embrace the digital revolution versus the rest who are less able to do so. And because of that, consequently, our sense is that the gap between the haves and the have-not within a society and across society is likely to widen further uh, with COVID. So we have to manage these three issues carefully. Now, from Singapore's perspective, how are we going to respond to this, or how are we going to turn these challenges into opportunities? I think we have a few key planks that we always talked about. Now, the first is to make sure that we entrench ourselves as a global business hub. But the role of business hubs will evolve. In fact, with the work from home that we were talking about, or work from anywhere, the traditional roles that hub plays in just congregating people together will be less relevant. But going forward, there will still be a role for global business hub. My sense is that it will be fewer, but of higher quality. And this business hub will be really places where companies and businesses can mobilize capital, aggregate talent, and protect intellectual property. So many of the lower value add functions of the previous business hubs will be outsourced and offshore to other places in a much more decentralized fashion. But the real important work in generating intellectual capital, aggregating talent, and mobilizing capital will belong to a few of the select and high quality business hub. And for Singapore, we intend to be one of these global business hub that offers such propositions to the business community. Now, the second thing that I think we need to be very careful to do is that with the disruption in the production and supply chains patterns, we need to ensure that Singapore continue to entrench ourselves in critical parts of the global value chain. And we are not like bigger countries where we can compete on the basis of price of labor or land. We will need to compete on the basis of the quality of our ideas, the intellectual property that we can generate, and we need to be quite selective in the areas that we compete in the different value chains. So, for example, in the semicon industry, we're not going to be able to compete with others based on the scale of production, but we can compete on the basis of the quality of production in niche areas and the intellectual property generated in order to enable those production to take place. Likewise, in a fragmenting or bifurcating world, the resilience of the supply chains will be very important. And given our status as a hub, we also want to make sure that we can value add to the global supply chains so that we are not just a center for arbitrage. We are a center for arbitrage with value add. And that will entrench our role in part of the global value chains of the multinational businesses that are based in Singapore and out of Singapore. So that's the second strategy that we need to do. And the third, in response to the growing disparity between the have-nots and the haves and the have-not, I think it's very important for us to spend time and effort to help our businesses and people to build real capabilities that allow them to continue to compete in a much more globalized world. So from our perspective, we don't think that we can keep out the competition, and we don't think that it is the correct strategy to try to protect our people from the competition. The correct way for us to approach this challenge is to make sure that our businesses and our people are up to scratch with the relevant skills and networks so that they can compete at a global level. So unlike many other countries, we never believe that we can survive on the basis of a local market or domestic market. We will always have to compete on the basis of the global market, and our people will need the kind of skill sets necessary to operate on the global environment, and we would need to be able to build the globally diverse teams in order to serve the global markets. So essentially, those are three broad strategies that we intend to respond to the three broad forces. The three broad forces being the growing geopolitical uncertainties, technological disruption, and the growing inequality within and between societies. And our three strategies is to entrench our role as a high-quality business hub, entrench our role in the global value chains by having niche capabilities to value add to the relationship that we bring to bear with the companies, but most importantly, to spend an inordinate amount of time and effort to bulk up the capabilities of our enterprises and people so that they can be globally competitive.
Yeah, that's a fantastic response, Mr. Chan. I think, what I can hear in that is despite this significant disruption in the ecosystem of the global economy, Singapore is remaining very true to everything that you've built as a nation over these years. So that's fantastic to see that continued dedication and approach that Singapore continues to take. And in this last area with the haves and the have-nots, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about this, the worker-centric trade policy that Singapore's had. You talked about building the talent and building the skills, and tell us a little bit more about the balance between trade and the goal of protecting and empowering workers.
Well, Denise, in fact, in many countries, I think some of the workers and some of the governments see trade as a contradiction or as something that is in conflict with protecting the workers. But let me perhaps share a couple of perspectives for us to see how we should take this issue forward, not just in Singapore, but across the rest of the world. Now, from a very basic economics 101 perspective, I think we trade because different countries, different sets of workers have different comparative advantages. Trade allows us to leverage on our respective comparative advantages so that we can produce more at the aggregate level, and then we can enjoy the fruits by sharing it and trading it. That's economics 101. Now, having said that, of course, trade necessitates adjustments for every economy. And it is a dynamic competition, it's not a static competition. So the fact that perhaps, the simplest example, I used to produce apple and oranges, and you used to produce apples and oranges. And one day we decided to trade, and we found that I'm better at producing apples and you are producing oranges. And you specialize in what you do, and I specialize in what I do. We all produce more in aggregate, and we exchange. That's essentially trade. Now, so that is a good global outcome. But what many people forget, and what many countries forget, is in the process of making these adjustments, we need to help our people who need to make those adjustments. We need to help our businesses that need to make those adjustments. If I specialize in growing apples, my previous orange growers will need to make some adjustments to get into a new trade, to get into a new industry. And likewise for yours, it's just that your apple growers will need to make the necessary adjustments because now you have decided to specialize in oranges. So the problem is not trade. The problem is that when we enjoy the fruits of labor, are we able to use the fruits of the trade? Are we able to use that to benefit our people and help them make the necessary adjustments? If any particular country is unable to share the fruits of growth and help their people make the necessary adjustments, then I think it will inevitably breed a pushback within the society against greater integration and greater trade amongst different countries. And that will be a net loss for the international economy, because that means that at the aggregate, we are all unable to leverage on our respective comparative advantages in order to produce more for everyone. Now, having said that, I can understand there are many countries where they are unable to make the adjustments. There will be a pushback against further globalization and further integration of the local economy. And from the workers' perspective, if we look at it from the workers' perspective, what does it mean to really help the workers? It means that we all would like our workers to have a higher quality of living, higher purchasing power. It means that we want them to earn the best wages that they can earn, and we want them to have the most competitive prices for the products that they consume. In economics term, we call that the purchasing power parity index. So I think with trade, many countries and many people will enjoy lower cost of products, and I think everybody is happy with that. But what people are perhaps unhappy with is the fact that some of the people may be losing their jobs or losing their old jobs, and they need to make the transition. And without help to make that transition, some of them might be displaced. And when they are displaced, they will push back against globalization. So I think we have to. So the real issue is for every country, how do we invest in the training of our workers so that we can help them keep pace with the adjustments needed? So in Singapore, I used to be the labor movement chief or the trade unions chief. I can understand in the US it's an oxymoron for the trade minister to have also been previously the labor movement chief. In Singapore, we do combine such duality. But having said that,
Mhm.
joke aside, is that we have a mantra in the labor movement, and it's that we don't protect jobs, we protect workers. And the best way to protect workers is to make sure that their skills are relevant and they can not only do today's jobs, but they can do tomorrow's jobs ahead of time. So we need to do that continuous training. And that is why in Singapore, we no longer just talk about compulsory education for the first 10 to 15 years for our students and our children. We need to shift to a concept of continuing education or lifelong education. And if we look at the technological cycles, I mean, it used to be that the Fortune 500 companies will be there for 50, 60 years. That's the average lifespan. But today, the Fortune 500 companies, the average lifespan has gone down to below 20 years and is going down further. So the technological cycle, the business cycles are accelerating, and we cannot expect our students, our children, to have just gone to college for the first 10 years, 15 years of their life, and then they'll be equipped for the rest of their life for the next 50 to 60
Mhm.
years. We are also going to have an extended working life. Now, that means that every country will need to seriously invest in the continuing education of their people in order for them not to be displaced and become irrelevant or have their skills become obsolete. So that is a great challenge for us, and that is difficult but necessary for us to overcome that larger challenge of the growing inequality between the have and the have-nots. Now, of course, in politics, if we choose the easy way out, then it is easy for someone to jump up on the rally stage and say that, well, I will, drop up the drawbridge, shut out the barbarians, and we'll live happily ever after. Now, that can work for a while. That can work for a while, but that is definitely not a sustainable strategy for the long term. And that will actually not allow us to keep pace with the developments with the rest of the world. So I think that's one perspective on how we need to combine what we call worker-centric policies with trade policies. Now, on the other hand, if we look at it from the company's perspective, it's also quite different. I think many companies will increasingly, worldwide, many companies will be increasingly be under pressure from the domestic politics to say that you should make decisions to either onshore, reshore, and so on and so forth. Um, Basically, governments or populist governments may or succumb to these tendencies to ask their companies to make decisions based not on commercial considerations or based on sound economics. But we must not forget market economies, the dynamism of the market economies, be it in US or in Europe, is precisely they operate on market principles. They work on market principles by serving the consumers and finding the most efficient, cheapest way to produce products and services for the consumers. From the company's perspective, trade is but that which connects the production with the consumption. And the pattern of trade will change in the coming years, as it has been changing even prior to COVID. And that's because if we look at consumption, the weight of the global consumption patterns will increasingly shift towards Asia because of the rising middle class in particularly China and India. So the consumer base will shift from Europe and US towards Asia. That's just by pure demographics. On the other hand, the production will also shift. Production will go to where either the natural resources are or where people are increasingly able to secure their intellectual property in terms of where they want to produce their stuff. And that is becoming interesting because that is also going to change. In the past, I think the primary considerations for many multinational companies, including 3M, could be based on land, labor, cost, taxation, and so forth. But going forward, I believe even global companies like 3M will be increasingly concerned with the following, which are quite intangible: the ability to aggregate talent, the ability to protect intellectual property, and the ability to mobilize capital based on sound and transparent legal processes that can provide that continuity and predictability over the long term. Most of the major investments around the world, including those by 3M, are not made for the short term, for the next 2 to 3 years. They are made for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So they need a predictable policy environment. So the nature of production as to where people site their productions will change. So if we combine that with where people produce and where the consumption is likely to be, we will see the new flows of trade. Now, this is not something which conventional analysis would tell government to do. Because if governments are just concerned with a particular set of trade numbers, whether is it a current account surplus or deficit, then I think the policies will be rather distorted. Because I don't think, unless you are a command economy, I don't think market economy work on the basis whereby governments can tell private businesses as to where to site their production, and governments can definitely not tell the companies as to where their consumer base should be. So I think it is not a very useful exercise for countries to try to, at least not a very useful exercise for market economies to try and tell their businesses to where to onshore, offshore, or reshore their production operations. I think most companies will work on the basis of sound commercial principles, and that is important. And it's important for us to make decisions based on sound commercial principles rather than based on geopolitics or based on politics, because that's going to distort the investment decisions. So I think there is now a great opportunity for us, and yet also a great challenge. The great challenge for us is that economic decisions will or may be increasingly be distorted by political decisions based on the need to respond to the political mood within respective countries. That's the great danger for us all. The great opportunity for us all is that actually with COVID and the greater realization of the need for supply chain resilience beyond supply chain efficiency, then many companies will begin to relook at their global production patterns and supply chain patterns to see where they can provide they can achieve the greatest efficiency and provide the greatest resilience to their supply chain network. And I think it will be a good development, because when people talk about the China plus one or the India plus one strategy, actually the real issue is not China plus one or India plus one. The real issue is anything but one, which is never put all your eggs in one basket. And that provides opportunities for us to have a much more integrated global supply chain. And from Singapore's perspective, our belief and my personal belief is this: greater interdependence is good for the world, as against greater independence. Greater independence, greater autarky is actually dangerous for the world. When the world do not have a shared interest in each other's prosperity and growth, it is a dangerous time from the security dimension. But the greater interdependence that we have, the more interlocking network of supplies that we have, and a greater shared interest in each other's prosperity, it makes for a greater world. And when we talk about bifurcation and fragmentation of the global economy and the supply chains, it's no longer determined by geographical distances. It's actually determined by who can you have in your network as trusted partners that will see through all the ups and downs, even through a crisis and beyond. And that is not determined by geographical distances. That's actually determined by capabilities and trust. And to this extent, I think Singapore will also have a niche area, because I think we want to distinguish ourselves as a trusted partner through the pandemic and beyond. And you can see that during the pandemic, I think 3M would know that we have never imposed any export restrictions on the products from 3M, even at the depth of the crisis, because we want 3M to be able to serve the international markets from Singapore. We want 3Ms, like any other MNCs, to be able to fulfill their international obligations out of Singapore through a crisis. And that's how we make a reputation for ourselves as a trusted partner, so that others are prepared and have the confidence to put their long-term investments in Singapore. Not unlike what we have done in the 1970 oil crisis, whereby we did not impose any export restrictions, notwithstanding the global oil embargo imposed by various countries. And that's how we build up our reputation as a trusted hub. So a long story, but essentially these are some of the challenges when people talk about workers' centricity and trade. Essentially, if we want to protect the workers, we need to up the capabilities of the worker, real capabilities, and not try to impose artificial barriers to avoid the competition in an unrealistic and unsustainable way. And if we want trade to grow, we must understand the determinants of trade, which has to do with the consumption and the production patterns. And then we should not artificially impose barriers to distort the natural patterns of trade, or to try to sway the commercial decisions of companies that operate worldwide. That will be in the best interest of the workers ultimately.
Mhm. Yeah, it's fantastic. And I just want to respond to what you said about the no restrictions on trade. And we really do appreciate the stance that Singapore took during this global pandemic, because, as many companies do, we have a global supply chain, and it is fundamentally designed to serve different geographies all around the world. But in such a situation as we faced, it became important for us to be able to export out of Singapore for a certain period of time. And we really do appreciate that flexibility and that partnership that we had with you and your government, Minister Chen. So I think from what I heard you say, I mean, Singapore is certainly a beacon of excellence, really focused on the right things to help to get through this time of uncertainty and divisiveness. So perhaps, some good advice to other countries and to our business colleagues too, as we lean into these challenges. And I do know that Singapore has launched several stimulus packages, and the actions that you've just outlined are very concrete, and it seems to really facilitate a focus on economic recovery and growth. I've heard that the GDP forecast for Singapore is 4 to 6% this year, and that's truly impressive. I also know that you're working on a couple of policies and other transformation initiatives, things like the Advanced Manufacturing 2030 and the Singapore Green Plan for 2030, as well as this Healthy Living Master Plan. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about those strategies and how they fit into this plan for economic recovery and continued growth for Singapore and the ASEAN region.
Okay, let me start with the government budget package. I noticed you use the word stimulus package, but we never use the word stimulus for a very simple reason. Because, but for a very simple reason, let me explain why we don't have that concept per se in Singapore. That's because you are right. In most countries, when they have a big fiscal package, it's usually to stimulate the economy, and that's because the consumption is very much domestic in a lot of sense. But in Singapore, there's no way that we can stimulate our economy. Trade is 300% our GDP, right? And we export most of the things, we buy most of the things from the world. So there's really very little domestic consumption that we can really stimulate. The large bulk of the economy is actually oriented towards the global economy. So we won't have the resources to stimulate the economy like what the US would be able to do, say, with a quantitative easing or other fiscal measures. So what we have spent, indeed, we have spent a lot of money from our reserves, and we are thankful for our forefathers for allowing us to be able to ride through this crisis without borrowing, despite the expenditure. A lot of our expenditure has to be focused on two areas. First is just to make sure that we get through the crisis by helping our companies maintain their capabilities. I say capabilities rather than capacities, because the capacities will be adjusted. But more importantly, a lot of the money that we spend is to help our companies and workers acquire new capabilities and to build new capacities. Our philosophy is that we are not going back to the pre-COVID world, so there's no point trying to ramp up the activities to get people or lull people into the false sense of confidence that we will somehow get back to the pre-COVID world. And I've always said that while we can get back to the pre-COVID GDP quantitatively, it will be quite a different economy qualitatively, even if we reach the same level of GDP, because the number of sectors would have changed, the share of the sectors in the economy would have changed, the type of skill sets we need would have changed, and even within a sector, the breakdown of the products and services we produce would have changed. So indeed, we have spent a lot of money to build new capabilities rather than to get us back to the old equilibrium, if you like, is to get us to a new normal. And we are preparing for that. And a lot of this work has to do with coming to the second part, which has to do with the opportunities in the advanced manufacturing sector and also the green economy, but not just for these two sectors. We see many new opportunities in many new sectors and existing sectors. For the new sectors, the opportunities include precision engineering, biotechnologies, info communications, including the agri-tech, the green economy, or what we call the green tech economy, and also many of the new urban solutions required, from energy management to water to waste disposal. So these are all the new opportunities. But we need to build new capabilities. Now, when it comes to the Manufacturing 2030 plan, our challenge is this: how can we increase the manufacturing output by 50% with the same amount of labor, land, and other resources? Now, that requires us to be very selective in the kind of manufacturing that we go in. We will not be competing on the basis of trying to produce a cheaper product that other people can produce. That is red ocean strategy, which we are not so interested in. We need to be able to produce things which few, and not many other people can produce across the world. So let's take recently I visited a company, a plastic injection, a mold injection company. In the past, they do the normal kind of plastic mold injection. Then they went on to that to provide for some of the advanced automotive makers, to be quite precise. So they went on to the precision manufacturing part. But even then, it's not good enough. Now that has gone on to the biomedical part, where they are producing things at the sub-micron level with a conventional plastic mold. And these are capabilities which very few plastic molding companies in that particular subsector would be able to do. So these are real capabilities that we need to build up, which are what we call blue ocean strategies, rather than trying to compete on the basis of producing cheaper plastic molds for conventional products, which many other countries with a greater abundance of land and labor will be able to produce. So in the Manufacturing 2030 plan, we are going into precision engineering, combining that with additive manufacturing and our ability to evolve products at speed. This ability to evolve products at speed will be a competitive advantage for Singapore. In the past, people take months, if not years, to design a product and to redesign a product. But now, with computer analytics, with additive manufacturing, we are able to generate new generations of product at speed. And I have this belief that the good enough but fastest will always beat the better but slower, because the ability to serve markets at speed is critical. And this is where we are going to go in a big way for our Manufacturing 2030 plan, to help our companies access platform solutions at speed. So if we look at a normal small and medium enterprise, it's very difficult for them to have their own unique design capabilities to redesign their products and production system. But if we can collectively provide them with the design and evolution as a service, then I think it will up the real capabilities of our companies. When it comes to the green economy, to be frank, we have been on this for quite a while, over the last 50 years, without using the word sustainability and sustainable solutions. The best example would be our water management. We started as a country 55 years ago with 3 reservoirs, hardly able to provide fresh water for ourselves. But over the last 50 years, we have dammed up every river that flows into the sea. Every drop of water that falls onto Singapore's soil will be used twice before it gets evaporated. We have built up our desalination capabilities. We have built up our new water recycling capabilities, and that allows us to be much more self-sufficient in our water than previously. Now, with that, we are now able to export many of these technologies, the water technologies, to other water scarce countries and areas. We intend to do that for energy management as well, because unlike other countries, we are an alternative energy deficient country. But we believe we can do much better in how we consume, produce, and distribute energy. And if we can do that, then again, in the next 50 years, we will have a breakthrough that we can provide solutions for many other alternative energy deficient countries as well. And if we can solve the energy puzzle, we will also be able to solve the water and the food puzzle. Because today, many of the food that we produce, including alternative proteins, will require quite a huge amount of energy. So urban solutions, urban mobility, autonomous vehicles, all these are new opportunities that Singapore can embrace, and we have every intention to compete in those areas. So these are some of the examples of the new plans that we are going into in the coming years to create a new areas of competitive advantage for our economy and for our workers. So that is again the best way for us to protect ourselves from the competition, not by shutting out the competition, but by taking the bull by its horn and building up real capabilities for us to create new niche areas for ourselves. So those are some of the plans that we have going forward.
Yeah, that's a fantastic perspective. Thank you for sharing that. It is continued evolution. I guess, the question I would have in response to that, just to build on it a little bit more, would be how do you see, recommendations for the private sector in engaging and working in partnership with the government in Singapore? Because, we really do want to participate and help support the growth in Singapore and the ASEAN region, honestly speaking. What recommendations would you have for the private sector?
Well, there are various things that I think the private sector can do with Singapore. Now, first, we go back to the issue of the global uncertainties. I think many of the companies will be quite concerned with their ability to serve diverse markets should the world bifurcate or fragment. Singapore is one such place whereby we can offer ourselves as a platform for companies, global companies, to serve the global markets and to guard against the vagaries of geopolitics. We have the widest network of free trade agreements. We are growing the network of digital economy agreements so that companies that are based out of Singapore can serve the global markets with a greater assurance against the vagaries of geopolitics. So that's one. The second thing that I think we can offer to partner the companies is that this is the place where you can mobilize capital because of our long-term policy and stability. This is the place whereby you can aggregate talent because it is a cosmopolitan society. You can build globally competitive teams, globally diverse teams to serve the international markets. And this is the place whereby you have a robust intellectual property regime from assessment, valuation to arbitration. So people are comfortable to put their intellectual property in Singapore. Fourth, this is a place whereby, because of our many constraints, it provides us as a platform, as a test bed for many of the new ideas. So, for example, we talk about the environmental and sustainability agenda. If we can overcome many of the challenges that we have at this point in time and turn them into opportunities, then many of these solutions can be exported to the rest of the world, and Singapore can again be a test bed and as a platform to the rest of the Asia region. So we take urban solutions as an example. Many people would like to have the quality of life in Singapore in a very densely packed city, but yet a very livable city because of the greenery that we have, the blue waters that we have. And many countries, many cities would aspire to have such solutions, be it traffic management, energy management, and so forth. So many companies are now coming into Singapore and using us as a test bed to see how we can export some of these urban solutions, as we call it, from the design of the buildings to the traffic management, energy management, water management, waste management, such that everybody can be in a more livable city. So that is one example of what we can do. Then there's another opportunity that many companies on the biomed side is coming to Singapore because given the diverse and genetic pool that we have, and as part of the region, we are a base which many of the biopharma companies would like to operate out, partly for the intellectual property protection, but partly because of the diversity of the market that allows them to have both the size and the diversity to cater to the global markets. And that's how they leverage on Singapore's unique position in Asia Pacific to serve a much more diverse market. So these are niche areas that allow Singapore to partner many of the companies to do this. But I must say this, regardless of which sector you come into in Singapore, and there are many, the important things are we provide the policy continuity and consistency and coherence for companies to make their decisions for the long term. And this is our promise to all the companies that come here, because we are not here just to attract companies for the short terms. We like companies who come in here with the long term perspective, and then we partner them to develop our workers and the global talent pool so that they can sustain their operations for the longer term. So that's what our value proposition will be, and that's what we like to work with companies that are coming in, and that's how we have worked with companies that have come before, including 3M.
Yes, thank you, Minister Chen. It is one of the things that has always impressed me about working with Singapore is, your long-term planning, the foresightedness, and that's exactly the way we try to work in our businesses too. So thank you. It really is a wonderful place to do business. And then, that focus on being future ready through the planning and the roadmaps for both talent and selective industries where you really truly can remain competitive over the longer haul. I'd like to make sure we have time for just a couple more different kinds of topics. And one of those is, within the region and being able to return to travel within the region. With Singapore being a critical node in the region, connectivity is so important. And we know it's an evolving situation. Singapore has done an amazing job in managing through the COVID, and we really do commend the Singapore government for working on the green travel lanes and travel bubbles to allow us to restart travel during the pandemic. We also know that the situation depends on what's going on in other countries. So I guess I'd really like to know a little bit more on what your view is about returning to business travel or even leisure travel. Many of our member companies are probably very curious about this perspective coming from you and from the Singapore government. Minister, thank you.
Thank you, Denise. In fact, Singapore is quite different from many other countries. Many other countries do not perhaps pay as much attention to international business travel because they have a sizable domestic business market. But Singapore is quite different. We are structured differently, and our focus is very different. For us, we need the international travel, and we offer ourselves as an international business hub. And this is why we want to be able to resume international travel, starting with essential business travel first, to give people the sense of assurance that they can meet safely. Now, having said that, I think we know that many things can be done remotely now via Zoom, WebEx, and so forth. But there will still be high quality transactions and relationship building that requires physical interaction. And this is the reason why we have moved on to non-mutually exclusive direct planks of two strategies. Now, one is that one has to do with the Connect at Singapore initiative. The thing that stops the travel nowadays is not so much the travel itself, but it's the quarantine measures. And we ask ourselves and we challenge ourselves, if persons in country A and B cannot go to each other's country and cannot meet safely, can both of them come to Singapore and meet safely? And so we have developed a protocol whereby we can allow people to meet safely in Singapore in a bubble of their own with rigorous testing and tracing capabilities so that they can meet safely and yet don't have to be subject to the quarantine measures. That's what we call the Connect at Singapore or Connect at Changi initiative, whereby foreign travelers are able to congregate in Singapore, meet, and then have themselves tested regularly to assure the rest of the participants, and then they move on. Now, the other part of the work came up because the World Economic Forum wants to host their next meeting in Singapore, and the latest is that they intend to do this in August this year. So it is both a challenge and an opportunity. How do we allow thousands of people from all over the world to come into Singapore safely, interact with each other safely, and then to go on with a clean bill of health as they depart Singapore. And we have set in the protocols to make sure that we have different protocols for people who are vaccinated versus the people who are not vaccinated, so that when you come into Singapore, we are able to know whether you are a potential carrier or you are healthy and you are all right. And then how do we then on a daily basis allow you to meet and interact as you would have prior to the COVID situation. So this requires a set of medical protocols that combines both testing and tracing, so that even if something happens, if we identify a carrier, we are able to isolate that cluster quickly while allowing the rest of the interactions to carry on. So with these two initiatives, we will be able to pilot different initiatives, the different forms of meeting for people to meet safely in Singapore. And I think that's important for our role as a global and regional business hub. And I think there will still be a market for people to want to meet safely with the health assurance necessary. And on the third set of things, independent of what Singapore is doing by ourselves, is that we would like to work with different countries on what we call a mutually recognized health passport, whereby you have assurance on either the vaccination status or the recovery status of the people who are coming through. And in the world, I think there will be a need for such mutual assurance, mutually accepted standards as we go along, because then this will allow the resumption of essential business travel first, and progressively perhaps to the wider mass tourism market.
Yeah, that's going to be very, very important, and it sounds like a fantastic approach. As we're getting closer to the end of our time, it would be remiss of me to not ask the questions that many of our participants are just wondering if we'll get to, and that's about the U.S.-China relationship. So, it really is that the U.S. seems to be approaching China as both a collaborator and a competitor. Could you share some of your thoughts on cooperation and competition dynamics between the US and China? And how do you think this relationship is going to impact the rest of the world, and particularly your region and your country, Minister Chen?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the US-Chinese leadership dynamics is not a zero-sum game. And I think we must always bear that in mind. Once we see it as a zero-sum game, then we are all losers from this whole process. A second point, I think, is that most countries, if not, I would say every country in the world, would like to get along with both the US and the Chinese. Now, having said that, of course, there are areas that the US and Chinese will compete, and there are areas that the US and Chinese, the Americans and the Chinese would also be able to cooperate. Now, let's talk about the areas of cooperation. I think both the US and the Chinese leadership have a shared interest in some of the geostrategic issues, from Iran to North Korea and so forth. They also have a shared interest to uphold and update the global trading system, the rules for the global trading system. So there are many things that I think they can and should work together. But on the other hand, it's inevitable that they will compete on many areas, especially on the economic front. But I must say this, being a competitor is different from being an enemy. we can all compete. The US compete with Singapore as well, but that doesn't mean that we are on bad terms with one another. So it's to be expected that the US will compete with China on many fronts. But then the question is, what will determine the outcome of this competition? And I've always shared this frankly with my US and Chinese friends, and I share the same message to both of them, which is that the outcome of the US-Chinese competition is not determined by a certain set of trade numbers. It's not determined by whether the US beat the Chinese or the Chinese beat the US. That's really not the issue. From a longer term geostrategic perspective, I would say this: whether the US or the Chinese win, in whatever ways that they define it, has to be determined by this: whose leadership model, whose economic model is more able to win the world over. And let me elaborate on that. I think it was then Vice President Biden who said this: every major power has the choice to either demonstrate the power of its example or to demonstrate the example of its power. And I think this applies to both the US and the Chinese. And for the rest of the world who are watching keenly, they would like to know which of these two will demonstrate the power of his example, and which of these two will demonstrate the example of his power. And I think that is very important. Now, the second factor as to determine who win is really who is able to mobilize and activate its networks of friends and allies, who is able to build that wider network to be a much more dynamic system. And that is something for both to, it's not a zero-sum game, but it's also not a binary option. And the third thing is this, that in the larger and longer term competition, who is able to innovate, who is able to be much more competitive. Now, this is the corollary of this interesting question is this. Today, the US has an advantage because the US has a 7 billion population. Why do I say so? Because the US is the most attractive place to aggregate talent across the world. That's why I say the US have a 7 billion population, because it can draw its talent from a 7 billion population base. And many people, many talented people like to join the US ecosystem and be part of the system, whether they are part of the American system or not. But now that is a big advantage for the US to be able to draw talent from the rest of the world. The question going forward for the US is that will the US be able to continue to maintain its attractiveness such that it has a 7 billion talent base for it to draw on, right? And that will really determine the competitiveness of the US system. And in order to do that, then it very much depends on how much US and the Chinese spend to develop their own infrastructure, develop their R&D system, and most importantly, to develop their people. Because ultimately, the competitiveness of a country comes from the competitiveness of its industry and people. The US have many things going for it. I think the Chinese also have various things going for it. Then the question is that out of these two models, which model is a more attractive one for the rest of the world to follow or aspire to follow? And that is the real essence of the competition. So it's definitely not a zero-sum game, and it's definitely not something that people believe that they have to choose sides one way or the other. Look at, if you look at Singapore's perspective, we believe that we can contribute certain things to the US-Singapore relationship. We can also contribute some things to the China-Singapore relationship. For China and Singapore, we have looked at the Chinese development across the decades, and we try to understand where are their needs at every step of the way, and we try to partner them to be constructive, to make a constructive contribution to their respective stage of economic development. We partner them in the Suzhou Industrial Park because at that stage they were building up their industrial capacity and they wanted to look at different models of industrial development. We partner them for Tianjin Eco-City because they were concerned about environmental sustainability. We partner them with the Chongqing Connectivity Initiative because the Chinese want to connect with the rest of the world, both physically through trade and also digitally and financially through the non-physical means of connectivity. Likewise, the US have a great presence in the Asia-Pacific region, and the stock of US investment in Singapore in the region is by far still higher than many other countries. And the US have an advantage of their supply chains and network in this region. And the US can continue to build on that, and we will also continue to welcome the US investments in the region as well. So it's not a zero-sum game, and I think that applies to Singapore and it applies to many countries in the Asia Pacific as well. But I think in order for us to move forward constructively for both the US and the Chinese, I think we just have to accept that there will be many areas of competition between US and China, but that doesn't mean that they need to treat each other as the enemy number one. And I don't think they should, and I don't think they want to. And the question is, how do you cooperate and yet compete at the same time? The two are not mutually exclusive, and there are as someone says, the Asia Pacific is big enough for both to have various areas of cooperation and competition with one another. But ultimately, I think it goes back to those points that I mentioned. The competitiveness of a country depends on the competitiveness of its people, its enterprises, its research and development, its investment in its infrastructure. And these are long-term factors that determine the long-term competitiveness of a country. The trade numbers is but a consequence of all these other factors. The trade numbers is a reflection of the flow between how the world connects production with consumption. So I think if we focus on the right things, then it can be a win-win situation for both. But if we are focused on the wrong things, then I think unfortunately, then it becomes a much more dangerous world. But ultimately, the bottom line is this: the US and China have a shared interest to coexist peacefully. And the greater the interdependence, the greater the linkages between the two, the safer will the world be. What the world do not want to see is a bifurcated world or a fragmented world. Bifurcated because people are forced to choose sides artificially, and I don't think any of the commercial companies would want to do that. Fragmented because there's a lack of global leadership, because the big powers, including the US and China, are mired in their own domestic issues and are less able to exercise global leadership to uphold the global system. So those are the dangers that we face as a global community, and those are also the challenges and opportunities for the US and Chinese to work together.
Yes. I mean, to build on that, I mean, if we could just quickly have one last insight from you, Minister Chan, before we start to wrap up here. But in that spirit of collaboration, could you point us to one area that the U.S. and China could really focus on and collaborate that would help to advance the economy in the ASEAN region? Would you have one recommendation or maybe 2 points to share with all of us, members of AmCham and all the friends of Singapore in this call?
Well, paradoxically, I think that the Asia Pacific has a tremendous need for both physical and the digital infrastructure to propel the Asia Pacific growth for the next lap of growth. And I think this is an area where both the US and Chinese can have its footprint and make its contribution to the Asia Pacific's economy. Whoever that provides that kind of connectivity, both physically and non-physically, will then be able to embrace and expand its network in Asia Pacific. So both the physical infrastructure, the connectivity, and also the non-physical part, including the data and the financial connectivity. So these are areas which, incidentally, both the US and Chinese will compete, but at the same time, they will also collaborate if we are going to have a more integrated Asia Pacific.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think we could spend all day, but I know you've got a very, very busy agenda, and I think we have more of the program to come right after us. So I just want to say thank you, because with that, we've come to the end of our time today. So Minister Chen, thank you so much for your candid sharing of what the Singapore government's strategic priorities and transformation journey are really all about. Coming from 3M, which is a company that has a global supply chain footprint, we've been in Singapore for a long time. We remain committed to improving lives in our communities. We truly appreciate the insights that you've shared on a broad range of issues, from how we can all invest in our own people, how we need to continue to raise our game in both capabilities and capacity to address the changing dynamics around the world and in this region. So I personally find your perspectives extremely insightful, particularly on the geopolitical developments we were just talking about with China and how that's going to impact our business objectives and the community around us. So certainly count on us as businesses to do what we can do, to everything we can do to support a path forward on sustainable growth and prosperity for all. It's really been my pleasure to have you here with us today and to engage in such an open conversation. So thank you very much, Mr. Chen, and I will offer the floor to you for any closing comments for this session.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for being so kind with your words. I'd just like to say to all the AmCham members in the Asia Pacific, Singapore is ready to partner you in your onward journey of growth. And if there's anything that we can do better and to be more relevant to your growth and development, let us know, and we'll surely work hand in hand with you for a better collective future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise.